So good to see y'all today. I'm Aprill Turner. I'm Executive Vice President of Communications for Higher Heights for America. We're the thank you. We're the political home for Black women, and thank you for joining us today for this conversation on misinformation, disinformation, and public trust. This is really near and dear to my heart. If you told me in 2026 I would spend my days combating misinformation, I would say, no, I don't. But this is what I do every day, especially as it relates to our Black women leaders. And now that we're in this particular time, this very, very different media landscape, we're calling it misinformation, but it's really propaganda that we're fighting every day. And especially as communication professionals, we're on the front line of this.
Well, I mean, look, we know that Black women in particular, very online, right? Very civically engaged. And that is what makes us a target in particular for mis and disinformation, especially as it pertains to politics, frankly, right? We know the influence that we have in our communities. When Black women are politically active, it's not just on their own behalf, but it is in their communities, in their sororities, in their churches, in all the institutions that they operate in. And so their role as trusted messengers carries a lot of weight in their communities. Mm-hmm. So the information that they are taking in and sharing with other people, it is very important what they are getting. There's a temptation to really assume that misinformation spreads just because people don't know better. That's not true. It's more complicated than that. A lot of times there can be a kernel of truth to that mis or disinformation. So when that happens, it kind of works alongside these existing beliefs or fears, and that can make it feel more real for people. It'll make them kind of more willing to accept confirming what they think they already know about government or media, right, or institutions. Misinformation travels faster than the attempts to debunk that misinformation, right? At the 19th, we tried to explain to people if something that they saw that might not be true, but by the time that gets out there, that sometimes is not amplified at the same level as the thing that they saw that was already false, that has already kind of made the rounds, right? If communities don't see themselves reflected in mainstream coverage, which is especially the case now with media consolidation, right? We know that we here, and also so many of us as Black journalists, are the trusted messengers in our communities. But as there are fewer of us in those newsrooms, fewer of us that are helping to get that message out wherever we may be working to try to do that, when the trusted messenger disappears, the misinformation can often fill kind of those gaps in representation. So those are kind of some of the ways that the false narratives make their rounds and really take root in our communities, and that's a lot of what we are up against.
In a creator economy too, where people, everyone is an expert on something. Everyone's an expert on submarines the next day. Everyone's an expert on, Iran this day.
Foreign policy.
Exactly, and it's just like, okay. You have your area expertise as well, and where you are outfitted to do your best work. Mm-hmm. I know as a breaking news reporter, I've had to just jump into a whole bunch of things and become an expert on Ukraine this day, and then Iran next day, and then California fires this day. But you also have so much power in your own background and understanding, and like fundamentally doing this work, having sources of connections to talk to people, and put yourself in places like safely. I at your own risk go into Truth Social, but safely amplify how you found something, who you talked to, your original reporting, original sourcing. It's also in the voice that you choose to elevate, as far as like, you have two people up here right now who are experts on something that you could be calling and quoting. I'm sure they'll share their information, but calling and quoting, asking them questions about what's going on with something, and introducing them to your community and your environment as well, and dispelling that. I don't think you have to necessarily go after a particular person's audience, but I know that you can actually establish yourself in these platforms and start talking about things in a way while you're also now doing, get ready with me videos, or however else that you're interested in.
Very effective.
However you're interested in it. Something that is authentic, that lets people know that I'm also a real person. I'm a Bitcoin bro who's a self-funded, whatever, self-claimed, all these things going on. And they have millions of followers. They get their message out very quickly, and before anyone can necessarily scrutinize it. Yeah. I think a perfect example is if you watched the Super Bowl and you saw Bad Bunny's performance. I can't tell you how many times during that performance there's a segment where I'm calling Benito, I'm staying. But there's a segment where he hands a Grammy to a little boy.
Yes.
And people thought that this little boy was Liam Ramos, who was a 5-year-old who was detained by ICE a month prior. And it was everywhere. I mean, it was like rapidly going before people could really scrutinize it, before journalists got to it. I saw some people that I thought would be, more privy to not post something like that, unintentionally sharing it, and it proliferates. And so it's something where, like, you as a journalist or communicator, or media professional, have, it's rapid. I can't overstate how quickly something can just, proliferate like that, and especially with certain narratives where, if it's something about like crime, and you can probably speak about this a lot, it's an emotional thing that resonates with people where you just say, crime is up, and it has not been scrutinized. There's no data, there's no nuance. It hasn't been, reported. It happens all the time, especially like with DC, but then that DC and many other places, like, I think homicide has actually gone down since the pandemic.
My work takes me at the intersection of criminal justice and immigration, so very busy time at the moment. And seeing a lot of narratives, false narratives, and I think really it is in the nuance, right? And where that misinformation I think takes hold is that there's a narrative right now, right, in terms of this current administration's immigration enforcement efforts that is very much rooted in the fact that immigrants are by and large, are convicted of criminal offenses and are dangerous, in this narrative that forces us into these false choices, right? Because even, and re-legitimizes a criminal justice system that isn't fair to begin with, right? And so as we understand, like, how communities have been criminalized, even people who have criminal convictions doesn't mean they deserve, some of the horrific consequences and treatment and things that are happening. And I think also, yes, very much, I think, a lot of consumers, right? When I travel, I usually try to watch the local news, and so much of local news coverage is still very much around crime incidents. And so as if you're, a regular person and that's the main way that you consume news, even if you feel, we have some data and have done research around people who feel safe in their own communities might still perceive their larger communities or like writ large unsafe because of these different narratives they're seeing. And I think one of the things that I think that floods people with misinformation that's really hard to disrupt are these think of like your neighborhood group chats next door and things like that are very much about safety and crime and what people are seeing that isn't giving folks a full picture. And not to say there's not harm we need to address, absolutely. But I think for most of folks in this room are from and around the DMV, right? When the occupation happened in August in DC, the administration, was talking a lot about how crime is down and it disappeared, and fully ignoring the fact that crime in DC had been down for some time. And the spike that we saw in crime right around the pandemic, blue, red, purple districts, cities, states, was very much due to an instability that was happening writ large, and we saw a decline, and we saw the things that actually made that decline happen, right? The investments in, violence prevention, affordable housing, and things like that. And so I think sometimes writ large, we don't want to think about the solutions that actually work because sometimes they're difficult, and sometimes we have to make the connections, right? That making sure people have Medicaid expansion is a public safety strategy. That doesn't always land well for the average person who is thinking about or maybe hearing about crime in their community, but it actually works. And so I think as we're trying to interrupt misinformation, it is bringing in the data, and I know that doesn't land for everybody. I get it, sometimes too many numbers, but also the stories and staying pretty disciplined on we know what works, and not getting pulled into those false narratives, even as we are trying to tell a story.
And we're obviously in a big year. It's a midterm election year. We've seen this in a few cycles now. There's lots of vying for our votes, lots of vying to misinform us. And especially, I appreciate what you said, people aren't misinformed. The algorithm is real. They are targeting us. Can you talk a bit about what you're seeing right now in politics compared to even a few years ago?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the tactics are not necessarily because of new technology. AI definitely making things a lot more sophisticated, right? Misinformation is not, Hillary Clinton's alien baby in the checkout line at the Inquirer. It's not that anymore. It's things that look, just as to Brianna's point, look very much like a lot of the credible news outlets that we are already consuming. And so, or somebody saying, you know, I'm a person that you can trust, you should listen to me, because the mainstream media has been so vilified, right? So it's like, oh, well, you can't trust them, you should listen to me, and then they get a big following. And so people are seen as credible even when they are trafficking in mis and disinformation. But take, for example, the Texas primary that we just saw, right? You had people who, there was confusion around polling places, where people were supposed to go to cast their ballot, right? People did not get the correct information. There maybe was a party that was not necessarily incentivized to provide the correct information to certain voters. And so then you get to election day and there is confusion. So I think, at this point, one thing about us now being in the 2.0 version of the political climate that we now see ourselves in is that we do know how a lot of this works. We do know a lot of what has been tried, and so what does it mean to be proactive about that, so that we are empowering our communities to be civically engaged, regardless of how they plan to vote, right? But if you are somebody who is wanting to participate in this election fairly, freely, safely, how do you do that? Like the explainer piece, we cannot hammer home enough. Like getting ahead of the mis and disinformation that we know is coming around our elections, continuing to say that our elections are rigged, continuing to say that voter fraud is out there, and we have to do something to prevent non-citizens from voting. P.S. That is illegal at the federal and state level. There's no legislation that needs to be created, and yet the SAVE Act right now is a thing that is being promoted as a thing that we have to pass this, because what are we going to do about these non-citizens? It's like non-citizens are not voting in voter fraud. It's not like a widespread thing in this country. But to the point that Elissa was making about the repetition on the other side of things, if you repeat the mis and disinformation over and over again, that is another way that these false narratives are taking root. So what does it mean to reinforce facts? So often, we may write a story, we're moving on to the next story, instead of saying over and over again, this is what you need to know, this is where you need to go, this is what you need to, you need to make sure that you are registered. You need to be constantly checking to make sure that your registration is valid and up to date. Check and make sure that your polling place has not changed, right? Here's where you need to go to do that. Like reinforcing factual messages to people, I think, is also something really important that does not always happen, especially from the trusted messengers that we are in our community so much.